Today we are going to talk about Langrisser's damage calculation, which the game really doesn't talk about whatsoever, and usually players can only go by more numbers equals good. In this episode, we are only going to cover the very tip, which is why it's titled Episode 0. We are not even really getting into the actual formula yet, just how we arrive at two of the numbers in the formula. The full damage formula is as you can see on the screen right now, and the main subject today will be the final attack stat of the attacker and the final defense stat of the defender, red and the blue numbers here. I'm dedicating one video to talk about this because stats come from quite a lot of different places, and together they form the most fundamental block in this tower of damage calculation. As for the rest of it, they are mostly pretty straightforward, you just gotta know what goes where, honestly. Personally, I'm not nerd enough that I will find every single number and punch it into a calculator before I go for a move, but I am kind of interested in knowing what factors are more important than others when doing damage, which is what primarily drove me to do my research. Tentatively, I'm probably doing 5 episodes for the entire thing, and a disclaimer now that most of the things that I'm going to be covering are actually not tested by myself personally, and not patient enough for that shit. So similar to my combat animation video, the original source is from Professor Mo Yuan on Bilibili, and his testing is comprehensive enough that it takes up half of his total video length. So I see little reason to doubt it, honestly. And the source mainly goes through the damage formula for troops though, so I will need to do some homework myself since I'm covering the topic for heroes as well. For me, I just want to bring this knowledge to the SEA or even global audience. And for those who don't speak Chinese, or those who wouldn't even know where to look up this sort of thing. With that being said, I've come to accept that Zilong's descriptions can range from misleading to blatantly incorrect, so keep in mind that there can always be exceptions to examples given. You will see a bunch of these sprinkled throughout the series. Getting into the real business now, the first thing I have to make clear is that damage is calculated differently between troops and heroes, so this is kind of a beginner thing, but if you happen to be a newer player, you might not be aware of this. That means for AoE attacks, because the source is from the hero only, damage is basically calculated twice, to the enemy hero and to the enemy troops. It's really no different from hitting two different enemies, so they have different stats, and of course they will take different amounts of damage based on the stats. However, for AoE attacks, the damage is shown as one big number above the unit that got hit, so you might not make that connection. It's like how you can do 30,000 damage to a burn with werewolves, but only 7k of that actually went onto the hero with like a holy sanction or something like that. For single target attacks, this expands into 4 possible different damage values, and taking into account the different animation speeds, things tend to get really fucking messy here. Quick pointer that critical hits are rolled separately for each scenario, so you technically have 4 separate rolls to trigger crit based effects like sneak attack. Technically in quotation marks, we will talk about this more when we go through crits in detail. For the final stat, I like to break it into 3 different sections: the pre-deploy, post-deploy, before reaching the final stat. So for pre-deploy, what does it actually entail? For the hero, I tend to call this the black plus green total, and it's the number you see on your unit when you are deciding what units to bring into the map. So this image on the right here, this 1304, is basically the black number plus the green number you see on your hero stat page. The black number here is the hero's base stats, and everyone will have the same number at each star level, providing you max the things that it's derived from. Green stats are just stats that come from a bunch of different other places, and one of them being enchants are derived from base stats. So enchants is pretty much the only thing that is a percentage of your base stat. Everything else is mostly just flat. Just for illustration purposes, maxing base stats essentially comes from 3 places, which is class mastery, bonds, and if your hero is SP, from the full SP unlock, the percentage stats. And for the green stats, there's equipment base stats, enchant values, the 2-piece resonance effect, and then there is this class mastery stones. And other than that, there is also the covenants, including the Dawn blessing that you get from Ragnarok, as well as casting. So class mastery, covenants, and casting did not exist during launch, so we have been getting quite a bit of stat inflation over time. And this is just an easy example to make sure that I'm not just talking out of my ass. You can see where this 736 is coming from. So 151 from Covenant and 142 from casting. You can see this in this page. 151, 142. And the 80 from stones. The 118 is the base attack for Ragnarok, and 75 is the base attack for Overlord's Badge. And then this 0.28 times 568 is my percentage attack enchant. That includes the 5% from the 2 pieces effect as well, so it's 5% here. So I actually have 23% on my enchants and 5% from the 2 piece effect, and 11%, 11 flat attack on my enchant. So that it's around 736. There's some decimal, but the game doesn't really show that to you. As for the troop pre-deploy, it's actually just very simple. The training ground overall stats and covenant troop bonus. Note that for troops, when we are talking about troop pre-deploy, we are just referring to this black number. This green number is something else entirely, and it's different from the green stats from the hero. So we'll talk about this later. The overall training is just this thing you see on your Aniki page, and this thing is applied throughout the, for whatever troops is in that particular tree, as well as the stat note on the final page that is applied to a specific class. So it will be a total of 80% and this flat stats. The Dawn Blessing is basically the things that you roll from the Ragnarok enchants, and you see there's a little bit of like soldier stats altogether. The Ragnarok, the Covenants themselves start with like base 6% all stats, and everything else is extra from the Dawn Blessing. Here I'm just giving an example. You can see that these werewolves from different accounts have slightly different base stats because the accounts have different value in the Dawn Blessing. If your account doesn't have a max training ground, you will see a difference here as well. So you can kind of tell from the percentage that it's on the exact same hero. Then you can see that 319, 317, there's a slight difference due to the Dawn Blessing difference. Post deploy is basically the stats after you start a map, and it fluctuates depending on effects that are typically in percentage values. Comparing my burns pre and post deploy, some quick maths will tell you that I have a 25% attack buff right off the bat when I load into the map. And you can just punch it through a calculator, the numbers are from here. And you can see that the 25% actually just comes from my weapon and accessory skills, which is 10% here, 5% here, and then my full moon enchant for the final 10%, so 25, that's very simple. So yes, the weapon skills and, equipment skills I didn't mention just now, so it's because these 10% and 5% or whatever percent is calculated in post-deploy, not pre-deploy. These stats do not go into the green number. And then after this, you can see now that my burn has a faction buff, and from the math, you can see that it's a 45% increase of my pre-deploy, which is exactly 20 more than what I had before. This proves that effects from talents, buffs, passives, and so on are actually additive, and they are applied onto a hero's pre-deploy stats. So whatever buffs, like if you have a 30% attack from like Akaya or CC White Egg again, it is an addition onto the factor that is multiplied based on your pre-deploy, which for my burn here is 1304. If you've paid attention, you will actually notice that my burn heart has a white color attack on the werewolves before casting faction buff, but then after he buffs, it turns into green. For those who are unaware, a green stat means that the particular stat is increased relative to pre-deploy, and a red stat means it's decreased. So if it's decreased and red color, that means you're probably suffering from a debuff because heroes don't usually start with negative stats. So this red, white and green is actually a sort of indicator for the hero, and you can kind of guess what gear they are wearing. So usually you can see if an enemy hero has green attack and in, there's a good chance that it's carrying Twilight Star. And you can use this to check for tank accessories as well. You can't confirm which one, but usually you can tell whether it's wearing like a Holy Arc, which is not an all stat, or my Bernhard here wearing Overlord's Badge, which is an all stat accessory, and it starts off as all of his stats are green. So what does this actually tell us? So this actually shows that troops do not benefit from enchant effects, as my werewolves have white color attack despite my burn being on full moon. Grease and Hard Rock obviously work for the full unit, as it's a buff and a healing applied to the full unit, respectively. But as far as we can tell, everything else doesn't, so every other enchant. As for the final stats, it's just the face value stat plus any in-combat effects, and the effects are still applied as the multiplier of your pre-deploy. So when you see, like, when you're entering battle, gain something percent attack, so it's actually still based on your pre-deploy, and it's an additive multiplier on top of whatever you have on your face value. So face value stat is basically what you see on your screen, and if you see your stat jump up in combat, that's because of in-combat effects. Well, I'm just kind of coming up with my own terminology here because there's no official terminology for this. In Chinese, we call this 面板, it's like whatever you see on your screen. So for Grand Shield here, it's her talent that gives her more attack and defense when entering combat with someone with equal or lower mobility. So before you click attack, you will see a particular stat that is on Grand Shield, and then when you actually confirm the attack, you will see sometimes the stat will jump up. So that is what I'm referring to when I say combat effects. And these are just examples of combat effects. I'm not really gonna go too deep into it. Just take note that whether something only procs in battle or not is one of Zilong's favorite things to get wrong, especially if it's released within the first 2 years of the game. Could be a face value versus final stat thing, or like whether you have to enter battle for that thing to proc. And yeah, it's AoE versus single target. There's a lot of these things that could be inconsistent, especially if it's something old. So now that we have cleared the concept of the post-deploy and final stat, at least for the hero, we can go back to talk about the green number we see on the troops, which is what I call the troop modifier. This modifier differs between heroes and is applied to all of their available troops, and each hero will have a different particular spread across the 4 stats. But the total of stats is actually the same, it's 100% split across the 4 stats. And this spread can be a factor of whether a unit is a good single target DPS. And I'm looking at you, Default Cherry. And also why certain tanks are better at tanking a certain damage type. Regardless, this multiplier is applied after all of these stat modifiers, including combat effects. So this 268 you see on the pre-deploy attack turns into a 322 in the face value after Bernhard casts his faction buff. So basically it means that both of these numbers benefit from buffs. So you have to, I don't know why they choose to display it like that. They could probably just add it together and apply the percentage to the entire thing. But that's just how Langrisser works currently. So yeah, basically you kind of have to factor in the percentage for both of them. And there's a similar concept for the hero as well, but for the hero it is an addition. So for those who don't know, Arena Mastery is actually applied at the end of the combat stat calculation, which means that because it's an addition, the hero's Arena Mastery stats do not benefit from any percentage buffs like faction buff. So it does beg the question when I learn about this, like whether flat stats are actually good in the Arena Mastery, or should you just put percentage crit on everything. Going back to troops, I'm lumping in the post-deploy and final stats together since we are already familiar with the concept. As for what affects troop stats, they are listed right here. So notably, hero equipment effects, or as the game likes to call it, equipment skills, are generally not applied to troop unless explicitly mentioning the word unit. We'll actually see more of this in the damage increase section, but yeah, just for example, like the Najot's Feather Crown, it says when battling against units with less HP, but this units is actually referring to the condition for the effect to proc. So if the troops wanted to benefit from this, it would have to say unit defense and magic defense increases by 3%, but it doesn't, so this stat boost does not work on troops. For troops compared to heroes, it's actually a lot harder to tell a difference whether like how much stats you have in combat compared to your face value, because like there's just a couple of different factors, right? When you enter the combat screen, the troop stats other than the HP don't show, their attack and defense and death, and combined with the fact that the stats are split up, so it's kind of unassuming, especially for a unit like werewolves where they get 40% of a stat when they enter combat. So combine that with like all the other effects, the troop stats in combat can actually get pretty crazy, but you just don't know because you don't actually see the number go up. So going back to the factors that will affect a troop stats, we'll just go through some examples. And starting off, we will have the troop effect, which is just the unique skill for each troop. And if it's like this Highland Warrior here, where it says attack increased by 15%, you will be able to see this number reflected directly in the troop's face value. And if it's when entering combat, then you won't be able to see this number. So it can be quite deceptive if you just eyeball the troop stats, because troops can have a lot of percentage increases from just random places, including the tech tree, which we cover here. So I've actually just gone ahead and split this into a table into 4 different groups, and the sections that are relevant to today's topic is actually the middle 2 groups, which is the face value increase and in combat increase. So the description for a couple of these are actually incorrect. You can just boot up your game, read the description for each tag, and compare it to what I have on the table here. And if you want to fact check this, you can actually just use the green-white indicator that I described earlier. So the green defense and magic defense on these werewolves here, all the way back here. So this thing, the green stats here, is actually because of this tag, which by the way is completely incorrect. We will cover this in a later episode. I think it's partially related to advantage effects, which is nothing like what it's describing on the tag itself. As for the hero talents, buffs and passives, they will generally benefit troops unless they specifically mention the hero. This is separate from the fact that in effects don't work on troops, because troops don't have in stats or skill stats for that matter. So yeah, here. You can just see HP, attack, defense, and MDef. They don't have in, so they can't benefit from in buffs. They simply convert their attack stat, the damage that they dealt, to magic damage, but it's still derived from attack. For example, for these talents, the troop will fully benefit if you meet their condition, such as Maclean troops will always get increased attack and defense when in water, and Azusa's troops will just get increased attack by default. So the in thing that we say just now is actually the reason why mages typically tend to have damage increased talents rather than in increase on their talents. And mages that happen to have in talents are typically more suitable for an AoE role rather than single target damage. This isn't always true, as you will need to consider other parts of the hero's kit, but it's generally pretty accurate, especially, the older heroes. And these are just hero passive examples. Again, the in version of Legion, which is meditation, the in part doesn't work on troops, and maybe that's why we actually quite rarely see this passive. Finally, some examples of buffs that don't benefit troops, such as T-Jest talent stacks, which gives int, and Oboro transform buff, which specifically mentions the hero stats. And so they both don't affect troops. And that just about concludes this episode, which covers pretty much everything related to raw stats. In a way, despite this series being about the damage formula, I'm not really doing much of any calculating, but rather just trying to show where each piece of the puzzle falls, and basically show the differences between troops and heroes despite using the exact same damage formula. The next episode is going to cover the easier parts of the formula, which is why I can fit in 3 of them in one single episode. And after that, we will get to glimpse into the insanity that forms the backbone of this game called Langrisser Mobile. I still think that the combat animation is the epitome of a 3 AM crackhead design that shouldn't work but somehow did anyways, just no one questioned it. And going forwards, we will actually get to see some design decisions that will rival that crackhead energy. And that's it for this episode. Hope you all enjoyed it. Peace.